The summer heat blazed down on Pine Grove Street as a weathered U-Haul truck rumbled to a stop in front of number 342. Inside the truck, 12-year-old Maya wiped the sweat from her forehead and pressed her nose against the window, taking in every detail of what would become her new home. The house wasn't anything special, just a modest two-story building with fading blue paint and white trim that had seen better days. But to Maya and her mom, it was everything they dreamed of after years of living in their cramped city apartment. "Well, this is it, baby," her mom said, turning off the engine and giving Maya's hand a gentle squeeze. "Our very own house." The pride in her voice was unmistakable. After all, she'd worked double shifts at the hospital for 3 years to save up for this moment. As they stepped out of the truck, Maya's sneakers hit the cracked concrete of their new driveway. The air smelled different here, like freshly cut grass and blooming flowers, so unlike the city's mixture of exhaust fumes and street food. A gentle breeze carried the sound of wind chimes from somewhere nearby, creating a peaceful melody that made Maya feel just a little less nervous about this big change. While her mom started unloading boxes, Maya noticed movement in the house next door. Through delicate lace curtains that looked as old as the house itself, she caught glimpses of someone watching them. An elderly white woman with silver hair stood partially hidden behind the fabric, her expression a mixture of curiosity and something else Maya couldn't quite read. Their eyes met briefly, and the woman quickly stepped back, letting the curtain fall back into place. Maya helped carry boxes into their new house, her arms aching but her spirit determined. Each trip between the truck and house gave her another chance to observe the neighborhood. The houses weren't perfectly maintained like in those TV shows about suburban life, but each one had its own character. Some had cheerful flower beds, others displayed worn garden gnomes, and a few had children's bikes leaning against their porches. As the afternoon wore on, neighbors began to peek out of their homes, some waving politely, others pretending to check their mail just to get a better look at the newcomers. Maya noticed how some smiled warmly, while others quickly looked away when she caught them staring. It reminded her of her first day at her old school, that familiar mix of friendly faces and uncertain ones. The sound of a door creaking drew Maya's attention back to the house next door. The elderly woman had emerged onto her porch, carefully holding a watering can as she tended to a collection of potted plants. Maya watched in fascination as the woman's weathered hands moved with surprising grace, giving each plant just the right amount of water. There was something almost magical about how focused she was on her task, as if the rest of the world had disappeared. Inside their new house, cardboard boxes created a maze in every room. Maya's mom was in the kitchen, struggling with a particularly heavy box labeled dishes, when she called out, "Maya, honey, could you start unpacking your room? It might help it feel more like home." Maya climbed the creaking stairs to her new bedroom, the one with the big window overlooking both their small backyard and the neighbor's garden. As she began unpacking her clothes, she couldn't help but notice how the elderly woman's garden below seemed to tell a story of its own. There were roses that had clearly been tended for years, their sturdy stems suggesting deep roots and careful pruning. Vegetables grew in neat rows, and a small bird bath stood in the center, its base half hidden by cheerful marigolds. Just then, Maya's stomach growled loudly, reminding her that they hadn't eaten since breakfast. The smell of her mom's famous spaghetti was beginning to waft up the stairs, comfort food for their first night in their new home. As she headed downstairs for dinner, Maya took one last look out her window. The elderly neighbor was still in her garden, but this time, she looked up and their eyes met again. To Maya's surprise, the woman gave her a small, tentative smile. And suddenly, this new place felt a little more like it could become home. Mrs. Rose had lived in her house for longer than most people in the neighborhood had been alive. 50 years of memories were stored in every corner, from the scratches on the hardwood floors made by her children's toys to the height marks on the kitchen doorframe tracking her grandchildren's growth. These days, she spent most of her time tending to her garden and watching the neighborhood change through her living room window. The arrival of Maya and her mother had stirred something in Mrs. Rose's heart, a mixture of curiosity and memories of her own first day in the neighborhood, back when everything felt new and a little scary. She'd noticed how carefully Maya's mother had planted tomatoes in their small garden patch, but the plants were already starting to wilt in the unusual heat wave. One particularly warm afternoon, Mrs. Rose was sorting through her old photo albums when she heard music drifting through her open window. The sound of a violin, slightly hesitant but sweet, floated on the breeze. Peering out, she spotted Maya walking home from school, instrument case clutched tightly in one hand while she struggled with a heavy backpack in the other. The sight brought back memories of her own daughter at that age, learning to play the piano. Without thinking, Mrs. Rose moved toward her front door, then stopped, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Times had changed since she'd first moved here, but some old habits of hesitation were hard to break. Through the window, she watched Maya nearly stumble on the uneven sidewalk, catching herself just in time to save both herself and her violin. "Oh dear," Mrs. Rose whispered to herself, remembering how her own mother had taught her that kindness shouldn't have boundaries. Still, she stayed behind her screen door, watching as Maya regained her balance and continued her journey home. Later that evening, while watering her beloved rose bushes, Mrs. Rose heard the violin again. This time, the music was coming from Maya's open bedroom window. The melody was familiar, a simple tune Mrs. Rose recognized from her years playing in the church orchestra. She found herself humming along, remembering how music had always brought people together in ways nothing else could. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her garden, Mrs. Rose noticed Maya watching her from her window. The girl quickly ducked away when she realized she'd been spotted, but not before Mrs. Rose caught a glimpse of genuine interest in her eyes, the same look she'd seen in her own grandchildren when they discovered something fascinating. That night, Mrs. Rose couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the violin music, about Maya's careful steps on the broken sidewalk, about her own silence when she could have offered help. Her late husband had always said that regret was the heaviest burden to carry, and she was beginning to understand what he meant. In her kitchen, Mrs. Rose opened the cabinet where she kept her most precious possessions. Behind old recipe books and faded photographs, she found what she was looking for, her collection of sheet music from her orchestra days. The pages were yellowed with age, but the notes were still clear and bold on the paper. As she sat at her kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold beside her, Mrs. Rose made a decision. Tomorrow, she would do what she should have done today. The world might have changed since she first moved to this neighborhood, but some things remained constant, like the power of a simple act of kindness to bridge any gap. She carefully selected a few pieces of sheet music that would be suitable for a beginning violinist. Among them was the very first piece she had performed in public, a gentle melody that had helped calm her own nerves so many years ago. Maybe, she thought, it could do the same for Maya. The next morning, Mrs. Rose woke up early, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. Sometimes, she realized, the best friendships start not with grand gestures, but with small acts of courage and the willingness to reach out across the fence that separates us from our neighbors. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Maya noticed something was wrong with her mother's tomato plants. The leaves were drooping sadly, and the soil felt bone dry under her fingers. Her mom had worked late shifts all week at the hospital, barely having time to sleep, let alone tend to the garden she'd been so excited about starting. Maya filled their red plastic watering can and gave the plants a generous drink, but something told her this wouldn't be enough. The summer heat had been relentless, and she had no idea how much water tomato plants actually needed. As she stood there, worrying her bottom lip between her teeth, the sound of gentle humming caught her attention. Next door, Mrs. Rose was already in her garden, the late afternoon sun streamed through Maya's bedroom window as she practiced her violin, filling the room with warm golden light. She was working on a piece for her upcoming school concert, Mozart's Violin Concerto No. 3. The notes weren't quite flowing the way she wanted them to, and she'd been stuck on the same passage for what felt like hours. Taking a break, she opened her window wider to let in the cooling evening breeze. The sound of a classical radio station drifted up from Mrs. Rose's garden below. The music was familiar, the same piece she'd been struggling with, but played with such grace and confidence that it made her heart ache with longing to play that well. Maya watched as Mrs. Rose swayed gently to the music while deadheading her flower beds. There was something about the way the elderly woman moved to the rhythm that suggested she knew this piece intimately. Without really thinking about it, Maya lifted her violin back to her chin and began playing along with the radio, trying to match the tempo and expression of the recording. The music stopped abruptly below. Maya's bow froze mid-stroke as she saw Mrs. Rose looking up at her window, a strange expression on her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Mrs. Rose disappeared into her house, leaving Maya wondering if she'd somehow offended her neighbor. But just minutes later, there was a gentle knock at their front door. When Maya opened it, she found Mrs. Rose standing there, holding what looked like an old leather folder, its edges worn soft with age. "I couldn't help but hear you practicing," Mrs. Rose said, her eyes bright with excitement. "You know, I used to play that very same piece many years ago." She opened the folder carefully, revealing yellowed sheets of music, their margins filled with neat pencil notes. "I was first violin in my church orchestra for 25 years. Maya's eyes widened as she took in the carefully preserved sheet music. Some of the pages had dates from before she was born, and little notes about tempo and expression that she'd never seen in her own music books. Would you like to come in?" she asked hesitantly, glancing back at her mom, who was nodding encouragingly from the kitchen doorway. What followed was one of the most magical afternoons Maya could remember. Mrs. Rose sat in their living room, sharing stories about her own musical journey while helping Maya understand the trickier parts of the concerto. She explained how the music should breathe in certain places, demonstrating with gentle movements of her hands. "You see," Mrs. Rose explained, "Mozart wrote this when he was young, not much older than you are now. He understood that music isn't just about playing the right notes. It's about telling a story with your heart." She hummed along as Maya played, occasionally calling out gentle suggestions. "Let it soar here," or "now whisper, like you're sharing a secret." As the evening shadows grew longer, Maya's mom brought them cookies and tea, listening as Mrs. Rose shared stories about performing in churches, at weddings, and even once in a small concert hall. "I was terrified," she admitted with a laugh, "but the moment I started playing, it was like the music carried me away. That's what good music does. It helps you forget everything else." Before she left, Mrs. Rose carefully wrote down some of her favorite practice techniques in Maya's music notebook. "Music is a gift," she said softly, "but it's even more special when you share it with others." She paused at the door, turning back with a twinkle in her eye. "Maybe, if you'd like, we could play together sometimes. I still have my old violin tucked away somewhere." That night, as Maya practiced one last time before bed, the notes seemed to flow more easily. Through her open window, she could hear Mrs. Rose's radio playing softly in the garden below. And somehow, the music didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like a conversation between friends, spanning generations, and connecting two hearts through the universal language of melody. The autumn wind scattered golden leaves across Mrs. Rose's back porch as she and Maya sat in the old wicker chairs, sharing hot chocolate and the last of the season's garden tomatoes. Over the past few months, their afternoon visits had become a cherished routine, but today felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the changing weather. "Something on your mind, dear?" Mrs. Rose asked, noticing how Maya was unusually quiet, picking at the marshmallows in her cocoa rather than eating them. The young girl had come straight to her house after school, still wearing her backpack, her violin case propped against the porch railing. Maya took a deep breath, the kind that suggested she'd been holding something in for a while. "Some kids at school," she started, then stopped, stirring her hot chocolate. They made comments about us being friends. They said it was weird that I spend so much time with you, because she couldn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Rose set her mug down carefully, her weathered hands trembling slightly. Because I'm white, and you're black, she asked gently. When Maya nodded, Mrs. Rose leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant with memory. You know, when I was about your age, things were very different in this neighborhood. She told Maya about moving into the house 50 years ago, about the changes she'd witnessed, both good and bad. She spoke about moments when she'd stayed silent when she should have spoken up, and how that silence had weighed on her conscience over the years. I remember a family that moved in across the street in 1968. Mrs. Rose said softly. They had a daughter who loved to jump rope on the sidewalk. Some neighbors were unkind, but I just watched from behind my curtains, too afraid to go out and welcome them properly. That's one of my biggest regrets. Maya listened intently as Mrs. Rose shared more stories about her own journey from being a passive observer to actively working to make the neighborhood a better place for everyone. Change doesn't just happen, she explained. It happens when people choose to be better than they were yesterday. But how you deal with people who don't understand? Maya asked, thinking about the whispers in the school hallways. Mrs. Rose smiled gently. By being exactly who we are. True friendship doesn't see age or color. It sees hearts. And you, my dear, have one of the brightest hearts I know. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation drifted to lighter topics. Maya's upcoming violin recital, the recipe for Mrs. Rose's famous apple pie, and their plans to plant spring bulbs together. But something had shifted between them, a deeper understanding that made their friendship even more precious. Maya shared her own experiences too, about being one of the few black students in her advanced classes, about the assumptions people sometimes made, about how music became her safe space where none of that mattered. Mrs. Rose listened with her full attention, her face showing not pity, but understanding and respect. You know what I think? Mrs. Rose said as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. I think sometimes people are so busy looking at what makes us different, they miss out on all the wonderful things that make us the same. Like our love for music, or how we both put way too many marshmallows in our hot chocolate. They laughed together at that, and Maya felt the weight of the day lifting from her shoulders. Looking at Mrs. Rose's kind face, she realized that true friendship wasn't about age or race or what other people thought. It was about two hearts recognizing something special in each other. As Maya gathered her things to head home for dinner, Mrs. Rose handed her a small package wrapped in tissue paper. A little something for your recital next week, she said with a wink. Inside was a delicate silver music note pendant, the same one Mrs. Rose had worn during her first solo performance decades ago. Winter had settled over the neighborhood like a thick blanket, bringing with it shorter days and longer nights. Maya had gotten into the habit of practicing her violin in the early evenings, knowing that Mrs. Rose loved to listen through their shared wall. But one Tuesday evening, something felt different. The usual sound of Mrs. Rose's television, which normally provided a quiet background to Maya's practice, was missing. Instead, there was a different sound, faint but distinct, a cry for help. Maya lowered her violin, her heart suddenly racing. She pressed her ear against the wall, holding her breath to listen more carefully. There it was again, Mrs. Rose's voice, but not her usual strong, cheerful tone. This was weak, frightened. "Mom," Maya called out, already running down the stairs. Something's wrong at Mrs. Rose's house. Her mother, who had just gotten home from her hospital shift, was already reaching for her phone and house keys. The side door to Mrs. Rose's house was always unlocked during the day, a habit from better times, she once told them. They found her in the kitchen, lying on the floor near the sink. A chair was toppled beside her, and scattered around were the pieces of her favorite teacup, now broken on the tile floor. I was just trying to reach the high shelf, Mrs. Rose explained weakly, trying to smile despite the pain evident on her face. My old bones aren't as cooperative as they used to be. Maya's mom, with all her nursing experience, quickly checked Mrs. Rose's vital signs while Maya called 911, her hands shaking as she dialed. The operator's calm voice helped her focus as she described what had happened, carefully following all the instructions being given. Your quick thinking made all the difference, the paramedic would later tell Maya. Falls can be very serious for elderly people, especially if they're alone for too long. While they waited for the ambulance, Maya held Mrs. Rose's hand, telling her stories about school to keep her mind off the pain. She talked about her music teacher's new puppy, about the funny shape of the cloud she'd seen at recess, about anything she could think of. Mrs. Rose squeezed her hand weakly, managing a small chuckle at Maya's description of the cafeteria's attempt at spaghetti. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, emergency room visits, and worried conversations. The diagnosis was a broken hip, not unusual for someone Mrs. Rose's age, but serious nonetheless. Surgery would be needed, followed by weeks of rehabilitation. That night, lying in bed, Maya couldn't sleep. Her violin sat untouched in its case. It felt wrong to play when Mrs. Rose wasn't next door to listen. The thought of her friend alone in the hospital made her heart ache. But Maya was nothing if not determined. The next morning, she asked her mom if they could visit Mrs. Rose after school. They found her propped up in her hospital bed, looking smaller somehow against the white sheets, but her eyes lit up when she saw them. "There's my little musician," she said warmly, reaching out her arms for a gentle hug. "The nurses here aren't nearly as good at Mozart as you are." Maya had brought her homework, setting up camp in the chair beside Mrs. Rose's bed. As she worked on her math problems, Mrs. Rose helped her with particularly tricky equations, just like she always did during their afternoon sessions. For a while, it almost felt normal. Before they left, Maya pulled out a surprise from her backpack, a small potted plant, one of the cuttings from Mrs. Rose's own garden that they'd been nurturing together. "So you have a piece of home here with you," she explained, placing it on the windowsill where the morning sun would reach it. Mrs. Rose's eyes welled with tears. "You know," she said softly, "people talk about guardian angels, but I think sometimes they come in the form of 12-year-old violin players who know exactly when to listen through walls." Spring arrived with a burst of color, bringing with it new life to the neighborhood and a special energy that seemed to touch everyone. Mrs. Rose was finally home from rehabilitation, moving a bit slower with her walker, but determined as ever. Her return had sparked something unexpected in the community, a chain reaction of kindness that started with one simple idea. It began when Maya noticed how overgrown Mrs. Rose's beloved garden had become during her hospital stay. The weeds had taken over, and the spring bulbs they'd planted together in the fall were struggling to break through the tangled growth. Maya knew how much the garden meant to her friend, and she couldn't bear to see it in such a state. One Saturday morning, Maya's mom helped her put up handmade posters around the neighborhood. Community Garden Day. Help restore Mrs. Rose's garden. They weren't sure anyone would come, but Maya had learned from Mrs. Rose that sometimes you had to take a chance on people's goodness. To everyone's surprise, people began arriving early that Saturday morning. The young couple from across the street brought their own gardening tools. The busy dad from 3 houses down came with his teenage sons. Even Maya's science teacher showed up, wearing a sun hat and carrying packets of seeds. Mrs. Rose sat in her porch rocker, overwhelmed by the sight of so many neighbors working together in her garden. She called out gentle instructions, sharing her years of gardening wisdom with anyone who asked. "Those peonies need more space to breathe," she'd say, or "the roses like it when you talk to them while you work." The children from the next block, who usually raced past on their bikes without a second glance, stopped to help plant marigolds along the walkway. Maya taught them the proper way to water the seedlings, just as Mrs. Rose had taught her that summer day so long ago. As people worked, they started sharing stories. The young couple admitted they'd always admired Mrs. Rose's garden, but had been too shy to say anything. Maya's science teacher revealed that she'd been inspired to start a school garden project after hearing about Maya and Mrs. Rose's friendship. During their lunch break, neighbors brought out folding chairs and shared sandwiches on the lawn. Mrs. Rose's porch became an informal gathering spot, where she told stories about the neighborhood's history, making everyone laugh with tales of gardens past and the Great Tomato Disaster of 1985. The busy dad mentioned how his own mother used to garden, and soon he was asking Mrs. Rose for advice about starting a vegetable patch with his sons. The teenage boys, who initially looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, became fascinated by Mrs. Rose's stories about natural pest control and companion planting. Maya watched it all from her spot near the rose bushes, amazed at how their small community was transforming before her eyes. People who had lived on the same street for years were finally having real conversations, sharing laughs, and making plans for future garden projects. As the day wound down, someone suggested making it a monthly event, not just for Mrs. Rose's garden, but for anyone in the neighborhood who needed help. The idea spread like wildfire, with people already volunteering their time and tools for next month's gathering. Mrs. Rose's garden was transformed by sunset, weeded, mulched, and blooming with new life. But more importantly, the neighborhood itself felt different. The invisible walls between houses seemed to have melted away, replaced by new connections and shared purpose. That evening, as Maya helped Mrs. Rose back inside, her friend squeezed her hand. "You know," she said softly, "gardens aren't just about plants. They're about bringing people together, about growing something bigger than ourselves." She looked out at her restored garden, now filled with evidence of the community's care. And sometimes, it takes a special kind of heart to plant those first seeds of change. Maya smiled, understanding that their friendship had grown into something larger than either of them had imagined. It had become a bridge, connecting not just two people, but an entire neighborhood. The summer before high school brought new challenges for Maya. Between preparing for a bigger school, harder classes, and the butterflies in her stomach about all the changes ahead, she found herself spending even more time at Mrs. Rose's house. The familiar scent of fresh-baked cookies and the gentle creaking of the porch swing had become her sanctuary. One particularly warm afternoon, as they sat shelling peas from the garden, Maya finally voiced the worry that had been keeping her up at night. What if I'm not ready for high school? What if I'm not smart enough, or good enough, or... Mrs. Rose set down her bowl of peas and adjusted her glasses, looking at Maya with that special mix of wisdom and warmth that always made everything feel a little better. "You know," she began, "I felt the same way before my first solo performance with the orchestra. I was convinced I'd make a fool of myself." Maya looked up, surprised. She'd always imagined Mrs. Rose as someone who never doubted herself. "Really? But you're so confident with music." "Oh, honey," Mrs. Rose chuckled. "Confidence isn't about never being scared. It's about being scared and doing it anyway." She picked up another pea pod, her fingers working automatically as she spoke. "Life is a lot like this garden of ours. Sometimes you plant seeds and they grow exactly as planned. Other times, the weather changes, or the bugs come, or things just don't work out the way you expected." A butterfly landed on the porch railing, its wings catching the sunlight. Mrs. Rose smiled at it before continuing. "But you know what? Those unexpected turns often lead to the most beautiful surprises, like that volunteer sunflower that popped up in the middle of my tomato patch, completely unplanned, but now it's the tallest flower in the garden." Maya thought about this as she helped prepare dinner that evening. Mrs. Rose had been teaching her old family recipes, saying that cooking was just another way of sharing love. Today they were making chicken soup, and Mrs. Rose supervised from her kitchen chair as Maya carefully chopped vegetables. "Too many young people these days think they have to have everything figured out," Mrs. Rose said, watching Maya measure ingredients. "But life isn't about having all the answers. It's about being brave enough to ask questions and kind enough to help others find their way too." They talked about everything that afternoon. Maya's fears about making new friends, her dreams of becoming a professional musician, and even her first crush on a boy in her math class. Mrs. Rose listened without judgment, offering gentle advice wrapped in stories from her own life. "You know what my mother used to tell me," Mrs. Rose said as they sat down to enjoy their soup. "She'd say, life is like a piece of music. There will be fast parts and slow parts, loud parts and quiet parts. The key is to play through it all with grace." As the evening light filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the tile floor, Maya realized something important. Mrs. Rose wasn't just teaching her about cooking or gardening or music. She was teaching her about life itself. Every shared moment was a lesson in resilience, in kindness, in finding beauty in the ordinary days. Before heading home, Maya helped Mrs. Rose water the garden one last time. The evening air was thick with the smell of blooming jasmine, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was singing its evening song. "Mrs. Rose," Maya asked, coiling up the garden hose, "how did you get so wise?" The older woman smiled, her face glowing in the golden hour light. "By making plenty of mistakes, dear, and by being lucky enough to have people in my life who helped me learn from them." She reached out and squeezed Maya's hand. Sometimes the best things in life aren't the big moments everyone sees, but the quiet ones we share with those who truly understand us. Walking home that evening, Maya felt different, not because her worries had disappeared, but because she knew she didn't have to face them alone. She had something better than confidence. She had a friend who believed in her.